Good evening, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to welcome you all today for the webinar on the Indus Water Treaty and its implications, a discussion that is both timely and deeply relevant to South Asian geopolitics, resource management, and international diplomacy. I am Kuhu Chauhan, and I manage admissions and outreach at ISPP. Here at ISPP, we believe in fostering informed conversations on critical policy issues, and today's session is an excellent opportunity to explore the historical significance, evolving challenges, and future prospects of this landmark agreement. We are honored to have Professor Amitabh Mattu as our distinguished speaker today. A renowned academic and expert in international relations, Professor Mattu is currently the Dean of Faculty at Jawaharlal Nehru University. With over 2 decades in academia, he has been a leading voice in public policy and diplomacy. His previous roles include Vice Chancellor at the University of Jammu and Founding Director and CEO of the Australia India Institute, highlighting his commitment to fostering academic collaboration globally. His expertise in South Asian geopolitics, particularly in water diplomacy, brings a nuanced and scholarly perspective to today's discussion, continuing to shape critical conversations in international relations. Thank you, Professor, for being a part of today's discussion. Moderating today's discussion, we have Dr. Kaustuv Bondre, an esteemed ISPP founding batch alumnus. Kaustuv brings a unique perspective to public policy through his extensive expertise in healthcare and public health. As the co-founder and director of Matrutvam and a medical consultant, he has been actively involved in shaping healthcare policies and services in India. He also serves as a visiting faculty at Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics, contributing to discussions on public health and policy. As the host of today's webinar, Kaustuv will steer the discussion with expertise and clarity, ensuring an engaging and insightful conversation. Thank you, Kaustuv, for being a part of today's session. And with such distinguished voices leading today's discussion, I can only encourage all the attendees to engage actively, ask questions, and gain deeper insights into the complexities of transboundary water governance. So let's begin. Kaustuv, over to you.
Thank you, Kuhu. Welcome, Professor. I thank you for joining us, and I welcome all of you to this wonderful session today. This is a session which is being conducted at a very timely, critical moment where, the Indus Water Treaty, with its far-reaching implications in the context of recent suspension, I must use the word abeyance, which was used by Government of India, that recent abeyance of this treaty in the wake of a brutal and inhuman terror attack in Pahalgam in Kashmir. Now, why this discussion is important? See, this treaty has been hailed as a diplomatic success, a rare cooperation between India and Pakistan, which has withstood nearly 6 decades of international relationship between the two countries, as well as multiple wars, terror attacks, cross-border terror attacks, and diplomatic disruptions. Despite this, it stood, and now, after Pahalgam, the government has decided to temporarily suspend the treaty. So, does that change the nature of water as a shared resource to a tool of strategy where India says that now nothing is off the table? So, this step by the country would have immense legal, environmental, geopolitical implications for which we have our distinguished guest, Professor Amitabh Mattu, who would be helping us unravel this issue. So, sir, can we begin by letting our audience know more about this treaty, that how it came about and why it has been hailed as a diplomatic success, and what happened now? Why Indus?
Thank you, Kaustuv, and thank you, Kuhu, and thank you to the ISPP for inviting me on this extremely timely, but also an important topic nonetheless. Even if Pahalgam hadn't happened, I think this is an area which needs to be studied more, discussed more. Frankly, I'm one of those who believed that the treaty needed to be reviewed in any case. So let me put my position clearly on the table. It is a treaty which has outlived its time. It was signed and negotiated when when our knowledge of our ecology was different, when technology hadn't moved in the direction that it has moved today, and when the demographic pressures were far less. It partitioned rivers rather than optimally utilize the rivers of the Indus Water Basin. So there's, I believe, a rationale for renegotiating this treaty, irrespective of the conflict between India and Pakistan. Having said that, the background was simply this, that when India and Pakistan got partitioned, the lands got partitioned, what happened, what would happen to the waters? The Indus Water Basin, India was the upper riparian states, including the Indus. Six rivers flowed into India and then to Pakistan, three of them. So the rivers that flowed from the Indus were Indus, which are the western rivers, were Indus, Jhelum, and Chenab. And the eastern rivers were Beas, Satluj, and Ravi. Pakistan, and particularly Pakistani Punjab, was dependent on the rivers of the Satluj primarily, and the canal system was far more developed in what was Western Punjab, which is Pakistani Punjab today, than Eastern Punjab. Eastern Punjab, which the Punjab that experienced the Green Revolution, was rather dry at that time. For a period, they arrived at an interim arrangement, a dominion arrangement, to try and see how they can fashion management of these rivers. But that interim agreement actually ended in April 1948, and for a month, uh, there was almost a crisis in April 1948 itself, because India stopped for a while the waters of the Satluj flowing into Pakistani Punjab, to the point where for a couple of days there was no electricity in Lahore, in a city like Lahore. Thereafter, there was an interim arrangement, but I think there was a recognition that there needed to be some kind of an understanding about how these rivers, water was going to be shared. Come in America, there was the president of the Tennessee Valley Authority, David Lilienthal, who had really, at the instance of FDR, managed this Tennessee Valley Authority, which was essentially an optimal utilization of the waters of the Tennessee and other tributaries between contesting states like Mississippi, Kentucky, Alabama, and had done so successfully to the prosperity of that region. He traveled to Korea first and then to India and Pakistan, and came back and wrote an article saying another Korea in the making, suggesting that India and Pakistan were, in this case, going to go to war over the Indus Water Basin. He persuaded the World Bank president, Eugene Black, to help India and Pakistan arrive at a treaty. So between 1951 and 1960, the World Bank was almost a mediator, a third party who helped India and Pakistan arrive at a treaty. But unlike the Tennessee Valley Authority, where there was a joint management, optimal utilization of the rivers, here they did another kind of British quick fix on this. They partitioned the rivers, not optimal utilization of the rivers, but partitioned the rivers. In fact, anyone interested going beyond what I say today should read the Indian chief negotiator, Niranjan Das Gulati's massive work. Niranjan Das Gulati was a civil engineer trained at Thomason College, which is now the Indian Institute of Technology, Roorkee, and he was the principal negotiator, and he helped negotiate the treaty. So in 1960, Nehru and Ayub Khan signed on to the treaty. The fact was that as the upper riparian state, India gave much, much more. And that was a product, in some ways, of Nehruvian internationalism, who believed that water was a common resource and they shouldn't use water as a weapon, and in the hope that Pakistan will learn to live with India as a good neighbor. In retrospect, that was a false hope. India also, because the canal system in Satluj was no longer going to be utilized to the extent that it had been, because the division was such that the western rivers would be given to Pakistan, which means Indus, Chenab, and Jhelum, and the eastern rivers came to India, Beas, Satluj, and Ravi, decided to pay a compensation of 60 million sterling pounds. about $100 million or 150 crore rupees to help Pakistan develop a canal or system, a new canal system, a new fresh system, so that the waters of the Jhelum and the Chenab could be utilized by it in a more optimal fashion. So Indian generosity was evident in this. There was a technological fix and an arrangement whereby India had unfettered use of the Satluj, Jhelum, Satluj, Ravi, and Beas, while Pakistan could get the Indus, rivers of the Indus, Chenab, and Jhelum, with some rights to India on for Run on the River project, for agriculture and other allied activities. But the fact of the matter remains that whenever India has tried to build some kind of reservoir capabilities, some kind of storage facilities, Pakistan has utilized the mechanisms of the Indus Water Treaty, which has a conflict resolution mechanism, either through a neutral export or through the permanent commission itself, or go to the court of arbitration. It's delayed, made all our efforts to optimally utilize the rivers that we have rights on. It has delayed it endlessly and often made it almost completely counterproductive.
So, sir, what we see here, there are two issues I understand. That one is the context in which the decision has been taken in India. So here it seems that Pahalgam precipitated this action from India. At least the general public tends to get that impression. But there is another underlying feature that in India, there have been voices since long who perceive, as you said, that the treaty has been unfair, where the treaty has been used to block the progress of India or any infrastructure, meaningful infrastructure on Indian side. And it has been generosity from Indian side, which has resulted into such a liberal treatment to Pakistan. So before going to the second aspect, first I would like to know from you that when we talk about this decision of government in the wake of terrorist attacks at Pahalgam, how effective? I mean, is it just temporary, or how effective do you see this as a punishment that the government intends to give to Pakistan? I mean, what is your take on this?
Let me first of all also focus on the unfairness, because I think that needs to be made clear. 80% of the waters of the Indus Water Basin go to Pakistan. Only 20% are utilized by India or are given, India has given rights. The catchment area that India has is 40%. Yeah. And yet it gets only 20% of the waters. That's one example of generosity. I pointed out also that India compensated Pakistan for the canal system in eastern Punjab. It paid off. And the reason why I think this treaty has been a model treaty, and there will be contrarians who will disagree with me, is because India was the upper riparian state. Counterfactual question, if Pakistan had been the upper riparian state, would have demonstrated the degree of generosity, the degree of patience, the degree of withstanding all the irksome behavior of an adversarial country? My understanding is that that is not true. In 2023 and 2024, India had asked Pakistan, again, quite independent from the issue of Pahalgam, that this treaty needs renegotiation. Of course, cross-border terrorism was one issue, but the ecological fragility of that basin, the demographic pressures, technological developments, all demanded that you relook at this treaty. Pakistan has not responded in any fashion, any meaningful fashion. Pahalgam was a catalyst, was a precipitation. It precipitated this final action of keeping the treaty in abeyance. But frankly speaking, I think unless Pakistan agrees, even in better times, to review the treaty, India should withdraw from the treaty unilaterally. Now, you might ask, is there a provision or a clause within the treaty which can allow India to withdraw from the treaty? There isn't. There isn't unless there is a bilateral arrangement by which they agree to negotiate the treaty. There isn't anything explicit within the 12 articles of the treaty. However, there is within the Vienna Law of Conventions, Article 62, which is defined within international law as the doctrine of rebus sic stantibus, which means if the fundamental circumstances under which you have made a treaty commitment change completely, you have the right under international law to withdraw from the treaty. And it's clear that the fundamental circumstances operating in 1960 are completely different from the ones operating in 2025. Because exactly for the reasons that India has outlined previous to the attacks in Pahalgam, which is the fragile ecology, climate change, demographic pressures, technological developments, and of course, to add to that is Pakistan's persistent cross-border terrorism. Adding the fact that you cannot silo Pakistani relations or India-Pakistan relations in one compartment. Now we are taking all parts of that bilateral relationship onto the table, including the Indus Water Treaty. That's on up for negotiation again. It's no longer going to be siloed from Pakistan's complicity in encouraging and abetting terrorism in Jammu and Kashmir. But as I said, even if Pakistan tomorrow turns a new leaf and says we're going to have nothing to do with terrorism, and you have foolproof evidence that it's not encouraging terrorism, even then, I would argue the Indus Water Treaty needs a fresh look. I think on the program today, you also have a former Minister of Water Resources of Nepal, Mr. Deepak Gyavali. I know he will disagree with me vehemently. I hope so. But I would encourage him to also intervene and convince me that the treaty should not be renegotiated.
So, sir, you do not see a possibility, or rather, that is what you want, that there is no reversion to the status quo ante. So we don't go back to the same treaty.
If I was a policymaker, if I was in a leadership position, I would say abeyance is neither here nor there.
Yeah.
It's a halfway house. But diplomacy calls for these kind of maneuvering, nuanced maneuverings, which are beyond me sometimes. I would say announce that from this date, unless you renegotiate a treaty, we are withdrawing from this treaty. Unless you agree to renegotiate this treaty, because this treaty is really out of date completely. And not only because of the fact that India's generosity has not been recognized or that India has given far too much, but because it partitioned rivers in a fashion that there is no optimal possibility of an optimal utilization. It didn't use the waters of the Indus Basin as a common resource, like Lilienthal had done in the case of the Tennessee water rivers. If you were able to utilize all the Indus Water Basin as a common resource, you could, in terms of hydro electric power needs, in terms of actually agriculture needs, in terms of other domestic needs, you would have been able to utilize this water in a much more effective position, which the treaty does not allow you to do, given that it actually divides, partitions rivers. But that was, as I said, a quick Western solution. They partitioned India, and look what that created. They partitioned Ireland, look what that happened. And look, they partitioned Palestine, and there you have what is happening in Palestine.
Sir, but in that case, considering the past record of Pakistan, as the treaty, you've mentioned that the treaty does not have an exit clause. So on any change in the treaty or the status quo can only be done when two parties, India and Pakistan, sit together and renegotiate the treaty. Now, considering the record of Pakistan till now, the trust factor is missing, and we believe that Pakistan may not renegotiate or may not be ready to renegotiate. But then, if India holds back or unilaterally decides to withdraw, what are the options before Pakistan? And do you see that this would create a negative fallout internationally also for India?
Beyond a point, I think if you're going to worry about what is going to happen internationally, as long as you know what's in your interest and frankly, what is in the region's interest, what is in South Asia's interest, you should do those things unilaterally. I think both realpolitik and principles match here. The treaty does not serve the purpose for which it was negotiated, and it does not serve Indian national interest. Unilaterally withdraw, there will be an international backlash. Pakistan has said that if they will see it as an act of war, fair enough, so be it. Let them come back to the table and renegotiate the treaty. They don't, they want to have a permanent enmity with India, then as the upper riparian state, you hold all the cards. That's the fact. You hold the cards. Now, the example often given is, oh, but you are the middle or the lower riparian state on the eastern side with China on the Brahmaputra and with Nepal and Bhutan, a middle riparian state, and in Bangladesh, an upper riparian state. Those do not look at this in a composite fashion. China has not signed a single bilateral treaty on sharing waters. China, if you think, is generous to us or is going to be generous to us because we are going generous to Pakistan, then you're living in a different fantasy land. China is going to do what it's going to do. It's building dams. You have to negotiate with China as you have to negotiate with Nepal, as you have to negotiate with Bangladesh or Bhutan, independently, separately, rather than only through the fashion of which state is an upper riparian, middle riparian, or lower riparian state, or the optimal utilization of the waters in that basin, whether it's the Brahmaputra basin or the Ganga basin, or what have you.
Yes, sir. So when we think about this decision, there have been, I mean, I've came across a lot of newspaper articles, and it said that the impact on Pakistan in short term is not going to be significant. So can you tell our audience that how does this impact Pakistan now?
Pakistan has been bloody-minded in terms of its attitude towards India. Each time India wants to do something which is within the provisions of the treaty on the Chenab or the Jhelum, whether it was Salal project or Dulhasti or the Kishan Ganga or the Bhaglia, they first go to the commission, then they go to a neutral expert, and if they can't get any leeway with the neutral expert, they go to the permanent court of arbitration. It's costly, and more importantly, delays the project endlessly, as I said, to the point where it becomes non-viable often. And there are several projects which have been lying there in cold storage because Pakistan has decided to take a legal route. And a legal route, in the best of cases, is a long, expensive route. But as I said, that if India wanted to be bloody-minded and wanted to hurt Pakistan, then the flushing of the reservoirs takes place usually during before the monsoons, and then so that the reservoirs are cleaned up and you can absorb the waters or the monsoon river waters. But if you were to do it earlier and open up the reservoirs, then you could restrict the flow of water during the lean period. Now, before the monsoons, when you are harvesting one crop and we're going to plant another, India has not done that. It's not actually restricting, as far as I know, there's no evidence so far that it's restricting the flow of waters into Pakistan at this time when the Rabi and Kharif crops both could be impacted, one in terms of harvesting, the other in terms of planting. So even after the provocations of Pahalgam, India has not done anything significant. It can hurt Pakistan, not only through the building up of future dams and projects and reservoirs, but even now by restricting the flow and during the monsoons, suddenly opening up the gateways, flooding the Punjab or the POK. So there are things that you can do, and not even sharing data. If India wanted, Pakistan, and one of the provisions of the treaty is that you share data. And if you stop sharing data, that will have impact. Of course, in these days, with technology being available, with satellite pictures being available, maybe not to a significant extent, but certainly telemetric data and hydrological data of the kind that India used to provide to Pakistan, if it stops doing that, that will impact on the way the water is utilized. See, the whole vision of the Indus Water Treaty was somehow that you could compartmentalize, silo politics from technological solutions. It was the great age of functionalism. People thought if you got doctors and engineers together and kept the politicians and intellectuals out, you could arrive at peace in the world. The European Union was built on that myth. Similarly, as I said, there was a belief that epistemic communities, knowledge-based communities, getting together would find solutions. Unfortunately, the fact of the matter remains that politics you cannot ignore. The politics is going to impinge even in the best kind of technological solutions that you arrive at through using the best engineers or the best doctors or the best epidemiologists. So we have to be, especially after COVID, I think we're aware of the politics, whether it's epidemics. And in this case, you're aware that there is a politics of water. And the politics of water transcends the fine tuning of the agreements created by lawyers and, in this case, civil engineers. The best civil engineers in the subcontinent negotiated the treaty. Gulati got the Padma Bhushan. Nehru congratulated him and said, you really done what no one could do. And Gulati's great words were, they want water, we want water, let's arrive at a solution.
Sir, I have one doubt. When we speak about this treaty, as you have mentioned elaborately, that the unfairness and obsolete nature of this treaty in itself was a very big reason why it needed to be renegotiated. Linking it with terror and forcing, saying that the treaty would be held in abeyance unless Pakistan shows credible evidence of stopping terrorism, cross-border terrorism. So does that dilute the stand of India on this treaty, the reason for renegotiation, and it becomes a zero-sum game, whereas what such treaty requires is if it was delinked from terror and like a win-win situation, which is in favor of them also and us also.
I think you link it to terror. That's kind of the ultimate reason, or that was the final straw which created the conditions by which you held the treaty in abeyance. But to add to that, the caveat that in any case, we have kept this in abeyance, but you stop terror, we want this treaty renegotiated. Let me tell you also one thing. The biggest supporters for renegotiating this treaty are the people of Jammu and Kashmir. The Kashmiris, to a man, woman, and a child, will stand up and say, the treaty was unfair to us because all the rivers that flow through Jammu, Kashmir, and Ladakh, from the Indus to the Chenab to the Jhelum, were given away to Pakistan. Today, if you are in Srinagar, in the summer, you have power cuts for 16 hours, or used to have at least till the last summer. There's not been a month, any week in the past 10 years that I have visited that you haven't had massive power cuts in Kashmir, in the winter, in the summer. So Kashmiris who believe that in some ways they have first right to these rivers, the Jhelum, which flows through the valley, the Chenab, which follows through much of Jammu, the Chandra and Bhaga, that's how the Chenab is named, and the Indus, which flows through parts of Ladakh. They have first rights, not the only, not exclusive rights, but at least the rights to use that water in a manner in which they can fashion the destiny of their people to a point where they can actually enjoy peace and prosperity.
Yes, sir. So I just want to zoom out a bit and look at a regional geopolitics. So when our present Prime Minister, first term he got elected, we had this neighborhood first. And then we've seen that somehow India has started drawing red lines, and violation of the red line is invite certain consequences. So is it a shift in the foreign policy, this action? Does it represent a paradigm shift in the Indian foreign policy where India is clearly laying the red lines and saying that, okay, take a look, and this is, you can't cross this red line, it should not be violated?
No, you see, I think this whole idea of neighborhood first and then neighborhood last, or you think you can bypass South Asia, I don't believe in it. I think you are part of this region in every way, historically, in terms of the region representing either a zone of peace or a zone of conflict. The manner in which you can, any way in which you construct India's neighborhood, it's important for you. I think India should stop acting as bilaterally in any patronizing fashion. Treat every neighbor as an equal and demand reciprocity in terms of behavior. And in terms of common resources, find a way that will lead to an optimal utilization, whether it's issues with Nepal or Bangladesh or Bhutan or Pakistan, which will be to the benefit of the people of this region. And if Bangladesh today is going to be bloody minded towards India, it should invite some degree of reciprocity. This whole idea of India should either follow a Gujarat doctrine, unilaterally make concession because it's the big brother, that smells of patronage. The smaller neighbors who are self-respecting also don't like that idea. Treat them as peers, treat them as equals, but treat them in a fashion that you demand, not in a kind of Trumpian fashion that I'll impose 80% tariffs on you if you don't do the same, but sitting on the same table, negotiate, talk to them as equals, don't have an imperious attitude towards them, but demand that they'll be responsible, sovereign states which will recognize that India has interests on which it's not going to compromise. And that finally, tying themselves in an equal fashion to the destiny of India, to the great Indian growth story, will be in their interests. I know there is a significant constituency for this. It's just that the bureaucracies in India, unfortunately, are so siloed between the Ministry and the Water Resources Ministry and the Foreign Ministry and all our agencies that they often don't have an all of government approach which sees this region as for its potential and recognizes that there are enough stakeholders who would be willing to be part of this project of building South Asia anew, afresh, because in some ways the old story has not worked. Whether it's the Indus Water Treaty or many of the bilateral arrangements that you arrived at with some of the smaller neighbors on your eastern side. And holding on to the Indus Water Treaty because there is this kind of a mantra, people say, oh, it has withstood the test of time, it withstood all the conflicts and wars. It's withstood all those conflicts and wars because India did not weaponize water. India did not use it as an instrument of its foreign policy through all these wars. And as I said, you should ask that counterfactual question. If Pakistan had been the upper riparian state, if Pakistan had been India's position, would we have expected that generosity of behavior? Is there an issue that Pakistan has not weaponized when it has been to its advantage to do so bilaterally? To the point where in its briefings, one of the air marshals says that Pulwama was a tactical attack. He admits on live television that they're using a terrorist attacks as an instrument of their foreign policy, tactical instrument. What is the strategic game at play? The strategic game at play is that Pakistan is besieged with problems of its own. A balkanized Pakistan, where an Islamist general seems to be in control, where the most popular leader of Pakistan, Imran Khan, is languishing in jail with reports of his death on the social media becoming viral occasionally, and God forbid, should it be true, you'll have Pakistan up in flames. And then you uses finally that idea that you have nuclear weapons so you can blackmail the whole region into submission. Frankly, I think it's time for us to grow up as South Asian countries and recognize that if we have to have a future together, then we have to behave like responsible adults with a certain degree of maturity, with a certain degree of generosity, and with a certain understanding of your enlightened national interest.
Well said, Professor. Professor, when we talk about Pakistan, and you've been a keen observer of Pakistan, you yourself have your origins in Kashmir. So, sir, when you talk about Pakistan, Pakistan is kind of an hydra-headed state. So you don't know who controls what. And in such situation, do you think in long term, this India's action on Indus water, for its own fair reasons, would have the intended impact that it will sit across the table and renegotiate? Otherwise, I mean, why I say so is maybe it is possible that it generates a lot of negative publicity for India. The pain that people feel can be used against India as a weapon again by the powers that be there.
Yeah, I mean, you have to find ways in which, as I said, the stakeholders in peace in South Asia are not impacted upon. You have tried a menu, a bouquet of options, for want of a better word. You try to ignore Pakistan as if Pakistan didn't exist and say, we'll escape Pakistan, we'll escape the region. It doesn't work because if Pakistan doesn't want to be ignored, it can't be ignored. It has a nuisance value at the very least. You try to engage Pakistan in through a liberal institutional constituency to try and create bilateral mechanism, common regional mechanisms. That hasn't worked. You try to engage Pakistan in terms of sharing common values and try and say that we are belong to a similar kind of civilizational story. We have a syncretic culture together. But frankly, every Indian policymaker I know is at their wits' end. What do you do if after nearly 75 or nearly 80 years of India's independence or Pakistan's creation, you have General Asim Munir uh, give us inflammatory speech in which he talks about India and Hindus and Muslims in Manichaean terms. This is the chief of the most powerful, the most professional institution in Pakistan, saying that Hindus are different from Muslims, Hindus are think differently, have value system differently, their worldview is different. We can never ever coexist. That's the kind of articulation that he did, and not to a jihadist constituency. If he had given it to a camp of the LET in Muridke or to the Jaish-e-Mohammed in Bahawalpur, I'd say, okay, he's playing up to the his constituency. But he was giving it this inflammatory speech to Pakistani diaspora, to the Pakistani diaspora. What kind of a message is that? Now, how do you separate the Munirs and the Shahbaz Sharifs from the people who genuinely are fighting for their rights, for democracy, for better relations with India? I've been in the track two, I've led track two. For 2 decades, I was leading track two at a time when Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was there and Prime Minister Vajpayee was doing. And you thought you had made an incremental difference. You thought you had built up a constituency. But unfortunately, that constituency does not seem to be able to survive the onslaught of dominant actors like the Pakistani army. So it is a conundrum. I would request the Indian School of Public Policy to actually try and get their best minds to engage with this issue. How do you deal with Pakistan, revisionist, Pakistan, a Pakistan which is whose raison d'etre seems to be just an anti-India identity. As I said, having studied Pakistan for 30 years, I'm still perplexed about what should be an enlightened policy towards Pakistan, which will pay dividends in real terms.
Very interesting point, sir. One question that has come in the chat box also, and I also had it on my paper, that when we look from the point of view of ethics, or as an audience member has mentioned, from human rights lens, so is it signifying a shift where the geopolitical imperative or India's security concerns we are trying to balance it with the humanitarian side of our relationship with the neighborhood, or for that matter, Pakistan?
I believe that as far as the Indus Water Treaty goes, there's a real politic element, especially in terms of keeping the treaty in abeyance. But if you renegotiate the treaty in a fashion, if Pakistan were to disconnect itself from terror, then it would be for the good of the people of the subcontinent. If you were able to manage and optimally utilize the rivers of the Indus Water Basin, not by partitioning them, but using it as a common resource, as has been done in many other countries of the world or many other regions of the world. And certainly the model on which the treaty was created, the Tennessee Valley Authority, of course, it was a treaty within federal units of the United States of America. But that model, if you use it, that you could arrive at a new deal in some ways, to use FDR's phrase, a new deal where you could use public interventions for common good rather than use only private money for private good. That was the FDR's vision of a new deal. If you could use public money and utilize the rivers of the Indus together for the common good of the people of South Asia, and do so similarly with the Ganga and the Brahmaputra, I think you would have a you would actually have more an ethical vision of South Asia, built on a sense of where India wants to be as a leader, as a part of this vision of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam.
Sir, in the same light, we have this Teesta issue going on with Bangladesh, which was being renegotiated. So my question is that should India develop a kind of framework which it can have these treaties based upon, or it is like the way we have been doing that one-to-one bilateralism is the way ahead?
I think, as I said, the basic principle has to be the optimal utilization of the waters rather than a compartmentalization or a partitioning, or an optimal utilization in a fashion that you uh, do not use one basin as an example for others, but customize it, bespoke solutions for each region. On the Mahakali, for instance, I think if you get Deepak Gyabali, he'll be able to enlighten you from a Nepalese perspective, perhaps on what he thinks about it. But I genuinely feel that at a time we have to get rid of old shibboleths, old doctrinaire philosophies, and think afresh. And it is incumbent on this generation, especially the audience that you may have in this virtual room, to think of new solutions, because past solutions haven't worked. You've tried everything in the box.
So there's a question which says that I mean, you've mentioned it already, that China, this decision by India, do we see China meddling into it, or some implication on Brahmaputra or even Bangladesh?
Tell me, as I said, has Indian generosity towards any of its neighbors influenced Chinese attitude towards India? And you imagine that China will mimic India as an upper riparian state if its interests are not served by uh, having a more aggressive water policy. It will do what it has to do on the Brahmaputra, and that you have to deal with China bilaterally. To imagine if you act not as generously as you have as an upper riparian state, somehow this will create a precedent and an example for China to do it. I think I wouldn't believe in that argument at all, because nothing that China has done vis-a-vis India has been on the basis of what India has done with any of its neighbors in terms of generosity or cooperation or any kind of bilateral arrangement that you worked out. The Sangpo is a river which they will utilize for their good in a fashion that they determine. If they want to weaponize it, there's nothing that you can do as far as Pakistan goes, which will prevent them from weaponizing it.
Sir, towards the end of our session, I have one final query, that when we look at a post now this entire episode, if you're looking at a very fair, just treaty that tries to maximize utility, as you mentioned, how would it look like?
In an ideal world, imagine for a second, Kaustubh, you were presiding over the destiny of a peaceful South Asia, where there was a calm, unprecedented calm. People weren't, terror was not being utilized. The armies would recede into the barracks. Nuclear weapons would not even be talked about. Uh, and President Trump would sit in his White House dealing with the problems with the United States rather than interfering in our region. Imagine there then a possibility is that you have the Indus Water Basin, which is still one of the most important resources, hydro resources in the world on this planet. If you were to invest in joint projects, in joint dams, maintaining, however, ensuring, however, the ecology of the region, that you are aware of what you can do by making interventions which have long term consequences for the environment, taking care of the people who depend on these rivers, who have historically depended on the water, recognizing that there are phenomena like climate change over which you not only have you to be sensitive, but over which you cannot exercise much control at the moment. And finally, also aware that there are huge demographic pressures. But having done that, use the greatest scientific minds, once you have that political vision guiding you, to develop this basin as a way of redefining the destiny of Punjab, Jammu and Kashmir, Himachal, Haryana, and indeed many of the neighboring states, in a manner in which the Bhakra Nangal changed the destiny of Punjab. But Bhakra Nangal again was a project of its time, for its time. We need to reimagine even the whole idea of big dams, what you can do with local communities, with local projects, with local interventions. That kind of reimagination requires a leap of faith. And I hope that we can arrive at a point where we can trust each other from at a micro level to national level to be able to make that leap.
Yes, sir. So, thank you, sir, for your views and the uh, the interpretation of the treaty that you've done. I think this has been very helpful for us to understand, apart from separate the signal from the noise and understand the intent behind India's action, the fairness element between the decision that we've taken and what the world would look like if Pakistan were to behave. So I thank you, Professor. If there are any queries, I would want the audience to give me the questions so that we can get them answered. Kuhu, over to you.
Yes, Kaustubh. So I was just going through the chat box and we have a plethora of questions there. So I think the latest is from Shashank.
Yeah. So again, I think we've covered this that when we talk about water, so one point that has been raised is when we talk about just division, is that just division based upon population? Because if we consider population as a factor, there's no doubt that we India and Pakistan together nearly are like around 20-21% of world's population, and still the water resources would be less than 10%. So population would always be a pressure from both sides, and water may never be enough. Even considering the ecological aspect that some water has to flow, ecological flow towards the sea. So is population important criteria, or it should be the contribution in terms of the basin? Because it's a dry region overall, if we look at the geography.
Demographic pressure is one variable. You'll have to, and that's what policy is about. You look at the various variables, and then you decide how much weight you have to give to each variable.
Yeah.
There is also whole idea of intergenerational equity, that to satisfy the needs of the present demography or population, you can't sacrifice the needs or the demands of future generations. So you have to, and policymakers have to design a framework by which you look at the competing pressures in terms of stress on the ecology to greater demands on population, and then find an optimal balance. And if you do it together, uh, and if you do it with the help of experts in this case, you'll be able to, I am sure, with the fine creative minds in this field, you should be able to arrive at an optimal solution.
Sir. So there has been another query regarding the cost. I mean, you've mentioned it, if touch and go. If you could answer this in detail, that what has been the cost of this treaty to Jammu and Kashmir as a region? And really, what India is trying to do by keeping it in abeyance, do you think it will make, at least in medium or long term, significant change to the development of Jammu and Kashmir?
See, the argument often made is that even under the existing provisions of the treaty, you have not utilized the waters fully. But that's also, as I said, because any initiative to create projects like the Kishan Ganga or the Vula Barrage, to the Dulhasti, to the Bhaglia project, immediately you have Pakistan intervening through the commission, through the demand for a neutral expert, through finally the permanent court of arbitration. However, if you have taken away Pakistan out of the equation, you could have done much more to be able to satisfy more than necessary the needs of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. Then you can do so today. Remember, even the Chief Minister of Jammu and Kashmir, Omar Abdullah, is one of the biggest advocates for renegotiating the treaty. He says, look, this treaty works against the interests of the people of J&K, and that is true. Even in a kind of simple fashion, we gave away the bulk of our rights on the western rivers of the Indus to Pakistan while retaining the rights on the Satluj, Beas, and the Ravi, the eastern rivers. And to be honest, the much of the prosperity that came through the Green Revolution happened because you had the riparian rights, you had the rights to Satluj, Beas, and Ravi, and some parts, of course, Jammu as well. But imagine if you had those unfettered rights over the Chandra and Bhagat, the Chenab, the Jhelum, the Indus. Imagine what you could have done.
Sir, if you look at you mentioned initially Article 62, Vienna Convention. So, is there any precedent that this has been used in such cases?
Including on Jammu and Kashmir in itself. India talked about a plebiscite in Jammu and Kashmir, but then it had its own constituent assembly ratifying the accession of the Maharaja to Jammu and Kashmir, and the doctrine of rebus sic stantibus was invoked. Rebus sic stantibus is a simple principle of law, which is applicable in domestic law as well as international law. Suppose you sign an agreement or an understanding based on a certain understanding of the situation or a certain assumptions about what the lay of the land is, and in a certain environment, if the whole fundamental basis changes, you can't be obliged to be part of that treaty.
Yes.
You're not. Suppose, as I said, India has been exceptionally generous. Otherwise, frankly speaking, you could have invoked rebus sic stantibus even in a war situation. That this was signed as part of a building a stable, enduring peace in the region. If one side declares war on you, you're not surely bound by a treaty that you signed when you were at relative peace with each other. Nehru went to Karachi, flew to Karachi to sign the treaty. Nehru believed in a certain sense of internationalism. It's that idealism which made Nehru take the Kashmir issue to the United Nations. A genuine belief that India and Pakistan, having been partitioned, would live as good neighbors. And that the United Nations and all World Bank, the Bretton Woods institutions were fair, transparent, good institutions. However, even in the case of the World Bank, he agreed to mediation with the explicit fact saying that this is nothing to do with Kashmir. This is only to do with river waters. So it accepted the mediation of the World Bank, siloed from every other issue. And only because he also believed that technical experts, Roorkee trained engineer, Punjab University trained engineers, presided by people who had gone to MIT, would suddenly be able to arrive at a technological fix. And they did. But that was a fix for a certain period of time, based on a certain Indian magnanimity, generosity, and a certain understanding of how the way relations would develop. The times have changed. India's interests have changed. The world has changed. Pakistan has changed beyond belief. We can't hold on to a treaty which was signed under circumstances which have been dramatically transformed since we first signed.
Sir, in the context of climate change, also there have been a lot of negotiation and concern globally. So, does that offer any international framework or any international instrument that can be used to reshape the treaty?
Yeah, I mean, you can always use conventions and you can obviously, if you had to renegotiate a treaty, you would be able to have a preamble which would begin by saying, having recognized the new democratic pressures, having recognized how climate change is impacting upon us, having recognized the fragile ecology of the Himalayas. Who was talking? You see, you signed this treaty, let me say this, at a time when anthropocentrism was at the center of your planning and your policies. Now we are looking at a more nature-centric view of the world. In that nature-centric view of the world, Indus Water Treaty is really out of date. In an anthropocentric view, also it's out of date, but certainly in a climate in which we are much more conscious of our fragile environment and our duty to our planet for not just this generation, for generations to come. It's incumbent on us. It's incumbent on all Indians and thinking Indians to demand that we not just keep the treaty in abeyance, but withdraw from it at the earliest.
Sir, thank you for your enlightening views on this treaty and your analysis, which helped us, our audience, to understand the issue. Sir, if you have to say something as a closing remark, and if India and Pakistan are listening, the powers that be, what would be that closing remark be?
Pakistan, stop terror, renegotiate the treaty. India, even if Pakistan doesn't stop terror, withdraw from the treaty and ask it to renegotiate it. Otherwise, be as generous as you can, but do not be bound by this framework which prevents you from an optimal utilization of the rivers, of the waters of the rivers of the Indus Water Basin, especially in terms of helping the people of Jammu and Kashmir, empowering the people of Jammu and Kashmir, but more importantly, sustaining the Himalayan environment, which is our biggest source of civilizational strength.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot. Kuhu, over to you.
I think it was a very insightful session, not just for the audience, for me as well. And I would like to thank Professor Mattu for being a part of this session, for enlightening us. Thank you, Professor. And we would love to see you at ISPP. And I am sure there are a lot of scholars present here for today's discussion, very eager to, hear from you. And I would like to thank Kaustubh also for moderating the session so beautifully. Kaustubh is our alumni, so I would request Kaustubh also, whenever you're in Delhi, do visit us.
Sure.
I'm sure it would be great for our current scholars. With that note, I would like to thank all the audience for attending this session, taking out the time on a Wednesday evening, joining us. Thank you for attending this session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Professor.